Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Faculty of Agricultural and Food Sciences, the seminar series. This week we have an offering, or this month, sorry, we have an offering from Agriculture and Agricultural Economics and Agribusiness, and it's Derek Brewin. And so I'd like to get Dr. Brian Olson, who's the department head in the department, to say a few words about Derek by way of introduction.
Thank you, Martin. It's a real pleasure to introduce Derek here. And I won't miss this occasion, though, looking at this big group, to actually start on a little bit of a different subject. I want to invite you all to a really great function at the university here. It's a lecture on Friday called the Craft Lecture, and it will be at 2 o'clock, 2:30 in the Richardson Auditorium. And I say it for three reasons. Number one is very much to honor a wonderful person who is a colleague of all of us in the department and was a great inspiration to many of us. Was one of the really great academics who illustrated really good research, great teaching, and wonderful at the extension site. And so that's the first reason. The second is I really want your attendance for three reasons. That's the first reason. The second is to pay tribute to a family that has supported the university so well in terms of fundraising efforts to bring an endowment in Darrell's name. And in terms of small funding, it's not easy to raise funding these days. And they've brought in total about $500,000, you know, and so just as a family doing a special tribute to Darrell, then it really is a wonderful example in terms of support for the University of Manitoba, for the faculty, for the department. And then finally, I want to just give a pitch to this. The individual that we have coming this year, the 8th Craft Lecture, is an individual who was the chief economist of the USDA. He was the chief negotiator for agriculture negotiations for a period of almost 10 years with the Doha round and so on. And his title is going to be Whether U.S. Agriculture Policy, and in the subtext there, it's Trump, Clinton, Brexit, WTO, NAFTA, and TPP. And so you've got someone who has spent most of his life in recent times right in the hornet's nest at the USDA. So please come for the three reasons. It's going to be a great lecture just in itself. It's a wonderful time to show our support for a family that's shown so much support for the University of Manitoba, and also to honor a colleague who went before who was such an exemplary academic in terms of our department. And so I'm not going to give nearly the...
We only have so much time.
And so I'm just going to say a couple words about, in terms of introducing Derek, who I have known for a long time. Derek's had three phases to his life. One was in industry. The second was, and then later on doing his PhD, and then the third coming and being a staff member here at the University of Manitoba. And Derek really is following very much, in my mind, in the footsteps of Darrell in terms of really being a good, really excellent, solid research. At the same time, putting teaching on an extremely high priority. As one thing that I found in my relatively short decade or so here at the university is that we have wonderful teachers at this university. And Derek is one of them. And then the third, he spent a lot of time on the extension side and has been heavily involved in areas like MRAC. He was on the Research Provincial Task Force and all sorts of things. And so with that background, I'm going to turn it over to Derek, whose title is The Games Firms Play in the Grain Value Chain. And one of the things I found with economists, they use these words in funny ways. For example, we have production economics courses, but they got nothing to do with production. And we talk about regressive. But it's not something that's bad or anything. It's just, something that is the way that economists use the word regressive. Ryan reminded me of that earlier. And then we also have this word gains that we use in a rather unusual sense. It doesn't mean gains. And I'll leave it to Derek to explain.
Yes, I will.
What he does mean.
I'll talk about what
Derek Brewin, thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you very much for coming. Yes, so I am going to talk about some of the work I've done in Canada's grain value chain. And the guys who are into supply chain management say you can call it a value chain if it's a consumer pulling at the end of the supply chain. I use supply chain quite a lot in class and stuff like that, but I think we can talk about the consumer as the driver of this chain, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And on the game side, I will, as Brian alluded, talk to you a little bit about what game theory means. So in games that we use in economics, we're normally talking about strategies, and they're usually mathematical models or algorithms that get us to stable solutions in a strategic game. And it's often, do firms compete or collude? That actually started with, the math of that started with Cournot and Bertrand in the mid-1800s. So that's, I'm really up to date in my theory, working on stuff from the 1800s. Edgeworth came in at the end of the 1800s and said that there's some new bells and whistles you could add to the Bertrand and Cournot game. But the idea, and the first time that game theory was really applied to economics was with the rise of John von Neumann, who was a mathematician at Princeton that was starting to put this theoretical stuff into a lot of different strategies. And John Nash of The Beautiful Mind worked on those strategies with regards to World War III scenarios. And they've worked on compete versus collude games, asymmetric information in bargains, different levels of costs in certain firm structures, different planning horizons. They've used game theories to optimize contract design and auctions. And so all that stuff has been part of the game theory of economics. And it has been applied to political science, psychology, biology. And if you want a really good book on it, there's something called, a book called Thinking Strategically. I had it as a prop and don't know where I put it. Anyways, it's a really good book by, sorry, I forgot their names. Dixit and, no, I can't, where's the other guy? Dixit's the first name anyway, sorry about that. And if you want to get into the economics of game theory, then Tirole, who's a Nobel Prize winner, has a really good book on the economics of game theory. And then one of the gurus in agricultural economic game theory is Richard Sexton at the University of California in Davis. And he has a presidential address on this in the 2013 Journal of Agricultural Economics, American Journal of Agricultural Economics. And then he presented on the Canadian supply chain at our Canadian Ag Economics Society's Ottawa conference in 2014. A very interesting winter, actually, as we'll talk about in a minute. So that's what the game theory of economics is about. And in most of the times, two things. Most of the time we're talking about firm concentration. And what Tirole was saying, what Tirole actually won the Nobel Prize for, was saying that actually the structure of an industry is really important to proper management of those games. The proper regulation to instill better welfare in the system, really tied to the structure of the sector you're dealing with. And so I am going to talk a little bit about the grain supply chain. Thanks to Fine Art, who gave me a really nice picture of a truck getting loaded up there. The grain supply chain starts with farmers planting a crop in the spring. They have expectations regarding their yields. They might be able to lock in certain prices, but mostly they have expectations regarding prices. Then they face random weather events and they end up with a random harvest. They've given a certain amount of inputs, but we don't know exactly what the output will be based on the inputs. So that's a farmer harvesting his grain, a truck being loaded up with grain. The grain gets moved to this elevator. It's going down into a pit. It gets lifted up in the air at an elevator. That elevator fills a grain car. Most of the supply chain we're concerned about, and the games I'm concerned about, happen within this supply chain that moves through rail. Most of our wheat crop, half of our canola crop, most of our canola oil crop are exported to other countries. And in the grain side, they get moved through the Rocky Mountains to the Vancouver port. That's the dominant move. And that's Cascadia Terminals in Vancouver. That's a bunch of grain rail cars loading a pit here, gets lifted up, moved along a leg, and gets put in a ship. And so the customer, the value chain puller in this system is the person who collects the grain at that place right there. The pit in the ship. We call it free on board. That's a price that gets quoted a lot in the market, free on board. And once it's in that position, it can go to the rest of the world for relatively low cost. So this is sort of the consumer at the end of the supply chain, is that hold in a grain car. Sorry. A little bit more on our supply chain. That's where it gets grown. So there is grain grown in southern Ontario and Quebec, but most of it gets consumed in southern Ontario and Quebec. There's grain grown in the Peace River part of BC, but most of that agricultural production in the interior is vegetables and fruits. So most of our supply of grains that gets exported comes from our prairie provinces, and we do have movements of grain from Brandon. That's Brandon, Manitoba, and we still have movements that go west to the Vancouver port from Brandon. Sometimes we get, but that particular haul from Brandon to Vancouver is one of the longest movements for grain to export position in the world. So we are in a spot where we're very far from the export position. They also get, Brandon sometimes will move to this Thunder Bay port, gets on a laker and moves through the system, ends up at an ocean port in Quebec. And if you've ever been to Old Quebec, they've got this big leg loading cars right as you're looking out of Old Quebec. That's actually filling up. Lakers dump their stuff there, or rail cars, and they fill up boats for port movements. Okay. So one of the main players in the games that I'm going to explore are the railways, and this is just showing the layout of the rails in Western Canada now, the main rails. And as you can see, there's sort of a cluster of blue on the north and red on the south. That's CPR on the south, Canadian Pacific Railway, CN Railway in the north, and they do have local monopolies. They have some monopoly power because they don't have a lot of competition for hundreds of miles sometimes from the other railway. So we're concerned about games that those guys might be playing. That's one of the important things we're going to look at. And the other group of players that we're concerned about are the grain companies involved in this supply chain. So there's international grain companies. We call them the ABCDs of international grain. That's Archer Daniels Midland, Bunge, Cargill, and Dreyfus. Actually, all four of them have some place in Canada, but the only one that's really got a major role in the supply chain I'm talking about, which is elevation at the farm and at the Vancouver terminals, is Cargill. The other big players in our supply chain are actually Canadian-run companies, or at least Viterra was until recently. That's Viterra and Pioneer or Richardson International. Those three companies control 80% of the movement of grain through the Vancouver port. They control 60% of the total capacity of elevation on the prairies. And 6 companies control 80% of the prairie elevation. So we're worried about those games that Cornell and Bertrand were talking about, that concentration. We're worried about that in elevation as well as railways. So there's lots of reasons why we get concentration, and one of them is just natural technology available to the industry. And network economies tend to have monopolies, like you see in utilities and telephone. but railways is one of them. And there's actually networks involved in the elevator system because they need to pull quite a lot of grain to fill that ship. That ship sometimes is 50, 60, 100,000 tons of grain. You have to pull it from a lot of places to get the right quality specifications to meet that customer's needs. So you need a pretty big network just to be an elevator. And when you have big fixed costs, like those networks cost a lot of money, there's actually an incentive for you to move a lot through that network, and that lowers your per cost unit. And that means the bigger you are, the more tons you're moving through that, the lower your real costs are, and that can lead to what we call a natural monopoly. That the biggest firm will have the lowest cost and have a big advantage over the rest of the other firms. We can also get firm concentration because of regulation. A patent is actually a forced monopoly into a system, and it's good that some of these regulations are good. The patent is a regulation, generates a monopoly ownership of that patent, and it sparks investment and innovation. So there are, Tyrrell's suggestion that you can have regulation that really improve welfare is really true when you look at patents, and Mehdi's working on that, and we'll talk about what he's doing. But there are regulations that were mistakes. Dr. Golden last time, he was the last presenter in the faculty seminar, and he was talking about bringing biotechnology traits to the market. That cost $250 million to bring a trait to the market. That's not that many companies that can invest in the R&D before and bring that kind of a product, have enough money to bring that to market. So that regulatory burden actually is leading to firm concentration. There's only big firms that are able to do that. Now, I'm still worried about the concentration of these firms and some of the theoretical ways that they can behave. The cartel is really, they get together and they say, we're going to act like a monopoly. We'll price at the monopoly price. And it actually generates the largest surplus for the firms involved in the game. If they can decide, stick to the prices that they agree to, they can get more surplus by playing as a cartel than any other game. But it's not very stable because I could cheat and undercut you a little bit and get as much as the capacity of my firm. I can get a slightly I might get quite a lot more quantity at a slightly lower price and can improve my my profits. But this old argument between Cournot and Bertrand, actually Cournot's outcome is a really interesting mathematical outcome. If you optimize profit in a monopoly by choosing Q, you get to this number that's between a monopoly and a competitive price. But I've always been uncomfortable with Cournot's outcomes because I could just change the game, not optimize according to quantity, and then pick my prices, and that destabilizes the outcome. I'll show it on a graph. I don't know if that's going to help or not, but I think that the Bertrand game is actually probably more realistic, that we will undercut each other if we have the opportunity to do that. If we can survive by undercutting each other, then I think we do tend to see that we compete down to the cost of delivering a particular good. But that doesn't work in all cases, because if we have a capacity constraint, we get to a capacity constraint, and I undercut you, it gets to the point where we're at fairly low prices. We both have a lot of product moving for our firms. When I undercut you, I don't actually improve my profits because I've already filled up my plant. So I lower my price, don't get any more quantity because I have a capacity constraint, and I don't improve my profits. And that's the problem that Edgeworth talked about. It's called an Edgeworth cycle, and I actually think it's very material to our supply chain. I think it could actually be happening. And just to show you that it's not, something that only happened in the 1800s, this is gas prices in Toronto in 200 or 2000, and this fella Noel was looking at Edgeworth cycles, and you can really see the behavior of the gas firms here, that they're once in a while are spiking way up, because when we compete ourselves down to just about cost, I can offer much less quantity into the system, and I get a very high price for the stuff that's remaining. Everybody else is capacity constrained, so I actually have a rare commodity, and I can offer a very high price, but once I'm offering a high price, it's in your interest to undercut me slightly and get the business I've been getting at that high price, and we slowly work ourselves down into back down to almost competitive prices. But it's a behavior that's observed in the marketplace. I just wanted to point that out. So I definitely wanted to explore it in the games that I was looking at. And then Tyrol's comment comes back in again that we have to be concerned about the interplay between the regulators and the games that they're playing. So as the rules of a game change, we can definitely see different behaviors changing in our supply chain. And that's a pretty important thing we're going to talk about. Regulatory change in our grain supply chain has been very important over the last 20 years. So we've seen that. So a little bit of digression on Econ 100. So I talked about Bertrand and Cornor were actually talking about a monopoly. But in this sector, what I'm really concerned with is a monopsony. And the monopsony gets in this case, we would get, there's a world price, that's that boat filled up with grain. They're paying a world price at the port in Vancouver. We think that there are costs to get the grain from port, and from the prairies to the port of some competitive, if we competed at the right level, we would get PC. So that's just the port price less the cost to move it. And we had some estimate of those costs because we had a very competitive year in 2012. We had the Canadian Wheat Board involved in measuring their costs in the past, so we have some idea of how much this cost is. But if I'm a monopoly within this system, or sorry, a monopsony, the monopsonist doesn't offer a higher price, but they buy at a lower price. So they're buying from the farmer at a lower price. They actually price off this thing called a marginal outlay. You can take Dr. Cardwell's class to learn more about what these areas mean. But essentially, this pricing point, that's a competitive price. This is a competitive quantity. And if a monopsony got involved in this market, they could increase their profits by the area A. So they would be, their break-even price would be PC. If they offered this price to farmers, they would be making this amount in dollars times this quantity in excess profits. So a monopsonist involved in the supply chain would be making A, but the farmer was getting this price and this quantity, now getting this quantity and a lower price. The farmers actually lost the area AB. And this area B was not gained by the monopsonist, was lost by the farmer. We call it deadweight loss. It's an economic loss to our sector, and it's a bad thing to happen. Too many of those is really bad for the sector, and that's why Tyrol suggests we should regulate things, because we get too many of those deadweight losses. Oh, so the difference, we call this price, the sector calls this price, the world price, minus the price to the producer, the export basis. And this is the export basis calculated by Quorum Corporation over the last 15 years. Now, there's a couple things that happened through it. One of the things is that the way that these are calculated, the way the blue one and the green one are calculated, slightly different. The blue one was actual costs measured by the Canadian Wheat Board while they were around. So we had the costs, the difference between what the farmers were getting and what they were selling in the export market. We had that actually in accounting tables at the Canadian Wheat Board. They could be sent into the Quorum, and we had that data. We didn't have that. The other grain companies weren't giving us that kind of information on the canola contract, but we knew what spot prices were in the canola market, and we knew what the export price was. So we just subtracted the export price from the spot price from the export price and came up with an average basis for canola. And as you can see, based on those two measures, they're slightly different, but it definitely looks like there was a upward trend in wheat and things had flattened out in canola. So there was a reason for, say, the Conservative government to say, hey, maybe the Wheat Board's not doing such a good job in managing that export basis. So there was some evidence in the first few years of this data set. And then this red one, this is the removal of the single desk for the Canadian Wheat Board, and now this red one, the wheat base, was calculated exactly the same way as the canola basis. And in the very first year the Wheat Board was removed, the wheat basis was actually even better than the canola basis. That number is $53.50. So that's a really competitive difference between the farmer's price and the export price. For me, it becomes kind of a thing we can hold on to as the best that the supply chain has done so far, and we can compare it to what happens after that. But unfortunately, this is what happens after that. So we started with the lowest basis ever, and then we went to the highest basis ever in the year 2013-14. And we haven't gotten that much better in 2014-15, and if you want to look at spot prices right now, the canola market's actually getting better, but the wheat export basis is still pretty bad. So what's going on? I wanted to explore the games that were happening when I saw that price spike. So that was kind of what I wanted to understand. Some of the regulatory changes that happened, the reason that we started collecting data in the first place, that data set was generated by Quorum at the same time that we created one new regulation to improve efficiencies in the rail sector called the Maximum Revenue Entitlement. The Maximum Revenue Entitlement's an average rate cap. They calculated what the cost was to move grain in 1999 and 2000, and they said, okay, we're going to give you that, Mr. Rail Company, for every ton you move through the supply chain. We'll give you an index. When your real costs go up, we'll give you a larger margin. When you make certain benefits to the rest of the sector, we'll give you a bit of a further bump for improving the system. But what that did, the maximum revenue entitlement allowed the railways to charge two prices to different grain companies. Before that, they had a fixed rate. They'd had a fixed rate since the 1800s when we set up the Crow rate. Except for the World Wars, we'd had fixed capped rates at very low levels that didn't make very much sense and didn't encourage a lot of investment by the railways. So when we freed up the railways to charge different prices, they actually sent discounts to people that were making more efficient setups for them and charged the guys that were causing them more expensive moves higher prices. And so we saw some change in the system because of that. The other major shift was that we removed the Canadian Wheat Board single desk. So that changed, possibly really changed the bargain between the farmer and the grain company. And then another important thing, I think, was during the sale of Viterra to Glencore. So we were selling a Canadian-owned firm, Viterra. It's still called Viterra here, but it's owned by an international firm named Glencore. And when that happened, the Canadian company had to sell off some of its assets. And especially it had to sell off some of its terminal capacity in Vancouver. And I think that might have changed the way something like the Edgeworth cycle would have worked in Vancouver. The other big thing that everybody else was saying, hey, Derek, there was a huge crop in 2013. And that's right, there absolutely was. So there was we had a record crop. We had a record wheat and canola crop, same year. The total production, that 57 million tons and 76 million tons is the grain that moved through the MRE, the total production of all grains in Western Canada. The wheat exports in 2012, 2013 were 13 million metric tons. They were 20 million metric tons in 2013. But the economic case for that actually increasing the basis is not really strong. We're moving more tons through a fixed asset. That should have decreased their average cost. But there were other things that were happening. We had prices falling in the fall, which created a lot of demand early in the year for deliveries. There's some suggestion that they planned for less cars than the railways, so there was less cars available, at least in the fall. And then we had a very cold winter. And when you have a cold winter for rail movements, normally they want to move 100-car units. That's the most efficient move. They have to move down to 50 car units. That increases the cost of moving the grain. So there was all these things were happening at once. So those are some of the other things that might have affected that basis. Now I want to get back to my graph, and I wanted to add a little more realism. So when we have a monopoly, if we were to have some monopolistic behavior happening in the system, we do have an inelastic supply function from the farmer. And now for those graduate students that are going to estimate inelastic supplies, you can't use a linear supply. Because if you make an inelastic supply, that means that the prices change quite a lot and the quantity doesn't change very much. If I make it linear through the area it was estimated, it goes straight through the origin, and it means that I will get positive deliveries of grain when the prices are negative, which is not a very realistic outcome. And then the other thing that we needed for realism is that there is demand for wheat in Canada. And when we decrease the price in the domestic market, we make all the feed companies that are using wheat, all their bottom lines have improved. The millers have improved. Actually, the consumers of Canada probably got lower bread prices by a little bit. So some of these people benefit when that activity happens, and we want to put that into the balance of the welfare. So I wanted to estimate that supply function, that demand function, just a little bit more for those grad students. If you want to parameterize this, look at Fulton 1998. You use the rule of the elasticity and just take a derivative of this when you set it equal to quantity. To parameterize this, we need, this is assumed to be the shut-off price for the producer. We used, in my model, I used $149. We get the elasticity, which is this E, has been calculated by FAPRI in the United States for our supply and for our domestic feed and food demand. So we have those numbers to run our model. And then I built the whole thing based on, this estimation was done in 2012, and we did it in the spring of 2012. We used the forecast for 2012 for the tons we moved and the prices that were there. Okay, so I estimated the supply function, the demand function. I had actual export price. I knew what the bottom line, the tightest margin I could get was. And I said, okay, what if a monopoly took over this thing? Where would it price? So after I've designed this game, where would a monopolist or a cartel of firms that stick to their plan, where would they price? And they would price at $186 to the farmer. So that's the cartel price outcome. So that leads to a price of 186. Because the price could have been 275 for farmers and they would have been moving more tons, their profits plummet. They lose 84% of their surplus, and the people who gain that, the consumer gains 53% of it, the grain handling sector, whoever is controlling that monopoly, gains 44% of it, and 3% of it is deadweight loss. So it's a very bad thing for farmers. Overall, Canada suffers a little bit, and consumers and the grain companies gain. So remember, the price outcome that we had before was 186. This is the price outcome we got on average in 2013-14. Now, 2013-14, we didn't actually have to, that was a long-term monopoly outcome. They actually didn't have to decrease their quantity to get this price. They got that gain on a record crop. They got this huge gain on the record crop. And this is why Dr. Gray's been going out there and saying grain companies made billions of dollars, because they got this gain. Essentially, the export price, that boat filled with grain, the price went down $1, okay? But our prices for farmers in the prairies went from 275 to 194. So the increase in our export basis went from 53 to 132. And this is, Quorum's already recalculated it for 2014-15, and things aren't much better. We've only gained a little bit, around $10 a ton in that export basis wedge. So things haven't gotten that much better. Part of it is that record crop sitting in excess storage at the end of the crop year. So we've had this push on our supply chain, now looking like we're going to have another push on this fall. So we've got our supply chain's been really having to deal with quite a lot of grain. Okay, so I did explore the Edgeworth games that we talked about. So what we would need for that to work is that if a single firm decided to say, hey, I'm going to pull out of this, we've competed ourselves down to $54 a ton, I'm going to pull out and see how much is left for me at whatever price I decide to charge. And that's when the Competition Bureau rules really came into play. This is the 71 tons of Cascadia capacity that Viterra had to sell to Pioneer, and the size of the crop also really matters. But if Viterra had those 71 tons in Vancouver, and they got the maximum rate we've seen for the turnover of that total crop, is 40 times, so they can go through that capacity 40 times. They would be able to move 16.7 million metric tons through Vancouver. That was more than the total export of wheat and canola through Vancouver. So a single firm, Viterra, could have threatened everybody else by saying, we're going to pull our supply out. For one thing, they could have said, we're going to undercut you, and it would be a viable threat there too. But if they pulled their supply out, it would actually worry everybody else that they were going to be able to, they were going to fill up their supply chains, and Viterra could charge anything they wanted with what was left. So there was possibility of these Edgeworth cycles working, but they were highly reliant on the quantity that was going through. And then once the Competition Bureau readjustments were made, so the capacity in the prairies and the capacity of Vancouver were reset, at the 5-year average crop, nobody could spike above the market and use up everybody else's capacity. So it wasn't a very credible threat to charge more. And Viterra could no longer make the claim, we're going to go after the entire market share, follow us down, or you won't get any deliveries, because now there was so much grain that I could say, go ahead, go down to your lowest levels, I'm going to take whatever I get at a higher price. So the Edgeworth cycle actually didn't hold in the model that I came up with for most of the quantities that have happened over the last 4 years. Some of the other impacts I wanted to talk about. So when we had that really big crop, we probably had a possible increase in efficiency, but that's, well, I'll show you historical cases, not that big of an impact on cost. But we did have to store another 8.7 million metric tons of grain. That storage probably cost about $177 million. The value of that grain could go down as it's stored, it lasts longer. Or sorry, as it's stored, the quality goes down if you store it too long. The value of that, if it went from number 2 wheat to feed wheat, that could be in the hundreds of millions in losses, in grade losses. And then we had to pay more demurrage because we had a plugged up system, we had more boats waiting. If I figure out all those costs though, and put it over the 43 million metric tons that were moved through the system, that only works out to $15 a ton. And I had a gain of $70 a ton. So there was an increase in the export basis, much more than the real costs that were faced by the system. Just to point to that fact that it actually could decrease the basis if you had more tons. 2008 was a record wheat crop when the Canadian Wheat Board was the single desk manager of the supply chain and of the wheat part. And so we had a 24% increase over the previous year. 2013 was a 34% increase. The ending stocks went up by 3.8. The ending stocks now are 8.7 higher. That higher stocks might have been something that worried the market. But in 2008, we had a 10% decrease in the basis because you had more tons moving through the system. So this is evidence that a larger crop should have lowered the basis. But we saw this increase by 148%. This is just showing what the quorum data says, the different shares of the export crop. So that there was an export price. This is the MRE. So this is well, it's actually the MRE. Sometimes the railways charge less than the MRE. It's within a few dollars ever. Actually, it's been within less than 1% for the last 10 years. But sometimes they charge a little bit less than the MRE. So this is either the MRE or what the railways actually charged in average rail rates. This is what the farmer got back. So you can see the best year on record for the farmers was the commodity price boom of 2007, 2008. And they had $28 in rail costs and $39 in other handling costs. So their highest return was $314 per ton. This just shows the progression of, so the rail rates are they're increasing because average costs in the railway are increasing. The grain companies' shares, this is that first year, the tightest, the least amount that the grain companies pulled out in the 15 years that Quorum was collecting data. And these are the prices that the farmer got. So it's really just pointing to the fact that we saw this $79 increase in the amount that the grain companies were supposedly taking through out of the system. This is as calculated by Quorum, using spot prices for this farm price and posted export prices. This is the same story with shares. I think I'll skip that part. And so there was supposed to be a $70 increase in the returns per ton for grain companies. So some of these companies are publicly traded. And so I looked at Northwest Terminals puts out their return per ton. And then Saskweepool was the company that became Viterra, and Viterra became Glencore. And in this year, it's a little messy whether or not Viterra was part of Glencore's books in that annual report. But you can see that Viterra did have a pretty bad year in 2012. That was the last year that they actually had a company. They might have been fighting for market share or whatever, but it didn't go so well. But so we don't have a 2013, 2014 for Viterra, but we do see that 2013 was actually a drop. Part of that 2013 year had an increase in basis, and 2014 was an increase in basis for most of the year. Viterra's year end is December, so this would have been an average return to the tons moved by Glencore at exactly when that basis was really wide. It doesn't look like $79 were earned per ton. Now Glencore is moving 40 million tons outside of Canada. They're only moving something like 9 million tons here. So if I took the increase that we got there, $12 increase, and only put it on the Canadian tonnage, then we might get to like $45 per ton. It's still not close to the $49 per ton that got moved. So I want to ask right now, is there farmers here, the posted farm price was $199 per ton. Is there farmers here that have gotten a lot better than $200 a ton for wheat over the last 2 years? Okay, well, we might not have a broad group of farmers who are actually trading wheat, but I think one of the things that could have happened, remember that one of the games that these guys can play is in their contracting, and we're looking at spot prices, and the price that farmers got on a contract level might have been different with what Quorum could measure in the spot market. That could be part of why their books are not looking a lot better, so they're actually paying farmers better. I hope that's the reason, but I'm concerned that it's not. So the implications of this were, well, we had the Canadian Wheat Board, the single desk was removed. The first year actually triggered an increase in competition, but it might have changed the available games to the firms that were left over. But the basis that we saw in 2013-14 was very close to what we would expect from a cartel. So it was a pretty bad basis. I'm going to touch on a few other, how am I doing for time? Anybody?
What time is it?
I got 5 minutes to go through? Okay, all right. So I have looked at competition on the rail side, the really long-term history of rail rates over in Canada, starting with the Crow rates of the 1890s. The U.S. started to deregulate in the 80s. The Canadians saw that actually improved their efficiencies, and the Canadian regulators responded with the WGTA. 1997, there was really bad service. The Canadian Wheat Board took the railways to court, and that led to these Este and Krager reviews. Not to court, they took them to the CTA review. And that sparked this maximum revenue entitlement that I think led to a lot of efficiencies. But in February of 2015, the federal government suggested they get rid of the MRE. The MRE right now is capping the amount that the grain companies, the railways can charge for moving grain. So they're talking about removing that, letting the railways charge whatever they want. Just want to touch on what the MRE generated in terms of efficiency. So we went from 960 elevators in 2000, or 99-2000, to 326 now. So we lost a whole bunch of elevators, lost a whole bunch of fixed structures that are no longer part of the cost of the system, and we actually increased the quantity capacity that was there. So the number of elevators that are there, some of them are huge, and they can make for really big, efficient movements, fill up 100 12 cars when those rail cars come up to their elevator, and that makes for a more efficient movement for the railway too. So we saw big gains in the turnover rates for elevators, the turnover rates for the terminals. That just means that there's more grain going through the terminals recently. But we also saw, this is really important, 67% of all we saw a 60% increase. Just about all rail movements of grain now are more than 50 car units. And that makes for a way more efficient system and should eventually lead to lower costs to move grain for the producer. But it also led to profits for the railways, and they started to invest in grain cars again. For the longest time, the only people who would own grain cars in Canada were the farmers or the government. But grain companies started to invest in rail cars. According to Quorum's last report, they actually own half of the stock that's being used now. So they've been getting returns, they've been lowering their costs, getting the MRE, and they've actually increased their profits enough so they're starting to invest in the supply chain. Couple more, so just so you know, that leads to two marginal outlays. These are results that are under review now, but hopefully will be published in the Canadian Journal of Ag Econ. And I'm writing this stuff with James Nolan, Richard Gray, Troy and Andy Schmitz. And our results show that if we remove the MRE, we will see an increase in rail rates. The increase depends a lot on how competitive the grain sector is right now. If the grain companies are already extracting a whole bunch of rents, there's less rents for the rail guys to take. So we actually see a lower outcome we see a lower price, unfortunately, for the producer, but we see a lower rail rate when the grain company's market power is high. So what high and low here means, the low grain market power is actually pricing at the supply function. The high grain power is pricing as if they were colluding. The rail market power, the lows here are the railways priced at the MRE, and this is if the railways are free to set their prices within the current structure. So it's somewhere between 100 and 150% increase in rail rates if we remove the MRE. And we've already got all this gain in the efficiencies because of the way the MRE was structured. We saw huge gains in the efficiency in the rail movement. What is it that we would gain by removing the MRE? That's an important question. We would like to explore that more. That means that we need to get into a better understanding of the games regarding the capacities of the firms that are involved and the constraints in the different cost structures. I'm going to mention that I have worked on biotech. So some of the regulations that really matter in that sector are that we actually imposed these patent rights. We created a regulation that led to increased investment. The two traits, LibertyLink and Roundup Ready, generate the lion's share of the gains that I've measured. This is showing that there was big increases to returns to those guys that got involved in R&D. These are returns from technical use agreements and selling private seed. This is just showing that the farmers benefited, and now we think it's to the tune of $1 billion a year from these LibertyLink and Roundup Ready traits. That's if they had, this is the return they would get if they were forced to use conventional canola without the without the herbicide tolerant traits. If they use the herbicide tolerant traits with hybridization, they get almost $100 benefit. And there's lots of acres of this happening, so that's why we're close to $1 billion in gain. This is just showing those calculations over the last 14 years. So at the beginning, when the new traits were coming out, they actually charged so much for seed that the farmers were not better off for using it, but this is the kind of benefit we're seeing now, which is close to $1 billion a year. This is showing the change in the ownership of those very valuable traits. And if you'll notice, two firms that have been in the news recently control almost all the ones that are getting big area. So I'm quite concerned that if Roundup Ready and LibertyLink are not competing against each other, we might see an increase in the price of that seed. I was going to mention Mehdi's work on the UPOV convention. That was a regulation that opened up our options in terms of the types of plant breeding rights we could offer. That's the kind of math that Mehdi likes to use and I can't understand. And so I'll just say that his results were that farmer saved seed and with the patents is actually not in the long-term benefits of farmers because it discourages investment. It might be to their gain in the short run, but in the long run, farmer saved seed is actually undermining the private sector investment, so it's not generally the case that it's good. And then he found that the researcher exemption with the patent is actually better than the patent alone. Very interesting stuff. And of course, the general message, I'm agreeing with the Nobel laureate that the design of our regulation has to match the structure of the industry we're involved with. And I'll just, I got involved in the concentration in the malting industry, and that's a really good thing because you get to go to beer conferences. Well, that's just to mention some of the other stuff I did. And I'd like to thank all the guys that I've worked with, starting with Dr. Chatterjee, who taught me game theory at Penn State. And that's Mehdi at the bottom, who's doing the most work recently. Thank you very much, guys.
I'm sure that's generated a lot of interesting questions. I'm sure Derek will take a good few. Derek.
Not a good economics question, but I was surprised to see the turnover rates at the elevators and terminals. I'm just wondering what kind of impact that had on grain quality. I would assume improvements.
Yeah, actually, I guess it would have. There would have been less change in quality, but honestly, I don't know what it was. That's a question for Digvar, I guess. Reg?
Oh, I have lots of questions through your presentation, but I'll stick with one. And first of all, I'll have to say you explained the MRE quite nicely, but near the end of your presentation, you called it it's capping the railways. And
I did.
that's a misnomer.
Yes, for sure. Let's get that out there again. It's not a revenue cap.
Right.
It does not limit the total
So you
revenue.
described it very nicely at the beginning, and then at the end you said it's capping the railways. So be very careful, we don't get that message out. But, so a question I would have, I guess, is in 2008, there was a shortage of wheat in the U.S. And so to me, if we take Churchill out of the picture, to me there's three corridors instead of, you mentioned only east and west, you didn't mention the U.S. corridor.
Yeah.
So assuming in 08 there was a huge pull going south, Mississippi and all that, and was in Minneapolis and all that. And so now that pull isn't there because they have enough of their own supply. But if prices get too high, I guess I was wondering if you've done any research on that. And the other thing is, you know, if the basis gets too wide in Canada, will the trucks start moving south again to Mississippi and that sort of thing? And the other is, also the other part of the question is comparing the MRE, because in North Dakota they don't have an MRE. So once you're away from the Mississippi, the price of freight goes up. And they say if you want better service, pay for it, right? And so that's the argument here, removing the MRE, we're going to get better service.
But do you believe you'll get better service or just a higher price?
No, well, it hasn't happened in North Dakota. They don't get better service. They pay way more and don't get better service. So that's why I was just wondering if you could comment on
Okay,
06.
so I'm an economist and I've assumed a whole bunch of things away, Reg, so my model solves. And I didn't really factor in U.S. movement. The whole thing was really built, our model really worked on the Vancouver movements because we thought that corridor was where a lot of the games were happening. But you're right, and when we see a really big basis, when we saw it in 2013, we saw more tons moved through the U.S. And you told me about opportunities moving to the U.S. for farm trucks. That's as much as I've worked it out. You know, I think you're right that there are all kinds of different ways that, like I brought up the feed sector. Like we could see more feeding, and some of those things, who knows what that'd be net gains for, say, rural development. If we had more livestock feeding, the value of all the grain farmland would go down. Maybe that'd be good for young farmers. There's lots of things that we don't really capture when we just focus on that one sector like we do. But I think it actually is a real loss to Canada if we can't reflect the export price back to the farmer in the most efficient supply chain we can build.
Yeah, just curious, with honey, we've got a really good sort of quality reputation to premium price, and what some producers or manufacturers do is buy honey from other countries that's cheap and then blend it with Canadian honey. And I'm wondering if the same thing happens in the grain industry.
Yeah, it does, but that's actually the reason that our price is high is because we produce CWRS 13, and most of our wheat is that, and so it is blended across the world with lower quality wheat from the places that we, but
Does the grain come into Canada, get blended here, and then shipped out?
well, we grow enough crappy wheat in Ontario that we have a pretty good grist, and then you can grow feed wheat here that doesn't make the cut because we get that random weather shock. We always have some feed wheat, so it could get blended. So we have a system that kind of stays around. It works.
I'm curious about these rail cars and their use as grain cars. You've got all these cars moving to port, and then are they coming back empty?
Yeah.
Because there's really nothing else to put in it. Well, truckers tend to kind of combine things if they can.
Yeah.
Now, again, grain trucks are very different than if you're moving meat or whatever. So is that part of the additional cost, is just moving these things?
Well, it's
back, or-
it's part of the cost of moving a lot of grain to export position. They don't put fertilizer in, but there is backhaul. So if there's a bunch of empty grain cars, they can put fertilizer on the thing, and we are getting some of the inputs that farmers need as part of the backhaul. And if Barry Prentice knows way more about the backhaul story than I do, but no, most of them are moving empty, and it's expensive, but it's still cheaper than trucking. Trucking is really
Yeah,
expensive.
trucking is very expensive.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Even if you get the backhaul for the truck. Just because it's so long, and rail is actually pretty efficient.
Back.
From the technology point of view, which are the risks that farmers will have in the future with the monopoly of the technology?
Yeah, the monopoly of Roundup Ready and Liberty Link. Yeah, I think it's such a gross concentration of very valuable traits that I would be surprised if this goes through. It's not just Canada. That's the dominant trait in corn and soybeans in the United States. I can't see that would happen with Monsanto's home country. So I would be surprised if it goes through, but I don't know all the dynamics of competition. I actually don't know if the Canadian Competition Bureau could stop it because there's not two firms that aren't in the Canadian market. But it would be very bad. I think it would be bad for farmers. But if they start to charge a lot for that seed, there might be a market for the next inventor in Canada. So.
One second, Mark. Go ahead.
Yeah, when we are exporting the products by the company, instead of that, suppose government as a corporation, if they will start as a type of business, then they can distribute the benefits among farmers rather than just by profit which is taken by company.
Yeah, we had something called the Canadian Wheat Board that tried to do that. But actually, just to be honest about that, there was lots of people who said the Canadian Wheat Board was less efficient. And actually, if you saw the export basis, the wheat board export basis against the canola export basis was actually not doing that well. You can have regulations that are meant to protect the farmer that actually make the system so costly that they're worse off. And that was the case with the investments in the rail structure, the difference between fixed rates and the MRE. The MRE made the system more efficient. And now there's more money on the table for the farmer in their supply chain if they get to capture some of it. Yes, right. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'm just curious about, you talked about, I think it was a dead drop or dead weight.
Dead weight loss, yeah.
And you said that there are policies that could be established to minimize that, or I was wondering what an example of policy would be?
Well, I think the MRE is one. So the MRE was something that limited the ability of the railways to drop that price to grain companies, really. They can only go to $36 a ton. But they can have this flexibility within it that allows them to make more business case, it creates incentives in their shippers to behave better. So that's a regulation that moves us closer to the competitive outcome. But what's Tyrol's story is that it makes a big difference what the sector is and the cues you want to send them, the way you regulate. But fixed rates, I think, Ryan would tell us as students, they're usually pretty bad for welfare.
One final question? Go ahead, Ray.
Well, just your point about the difference in basis between the wheat and canola. Canola is a fairly homogeneous product, right? And
Yeah.
wheat changes quite dramatically between, you know, grades and proteins and all those things. So it's just naturally going to be higher. But on top of that, if you get weather issues from one part of the prairies to the other, that again complicates it.
Well-
So drawing to fill a ship of a certain grade, it just raises the cost. So I don't know if you have a comment on that.
Well, I kind of agreed with you, and when I worked at the wheat board, I think I made that excuse. Yeah, that's why our costs are higher. We have a much more complex commodity to deal with. But in the first year, without the wheat board, the basis for wheat was lower than canola. So there was possible to make a pretty efficient wheat supply chain too. I think what might have been going on there is that Viterra was hammering it.
They were manipulating it.
Yeah, they were trying to get it really low, and we lost a lot of independent elevators that year, and so it might have been a game that Viterra was playing, but it was an idea of how tight it could be. It could be pretty efficient.
And how many times has Viterra gone broke?
Uh,
So you're suggesting they're being predatory?
Yeah, I think it's possible they were being predatory, so I'm using a predatory price for my lowest wedge. But the other thing with canola, Reg, is that there's a big domestic demand. We have big domestic crush, and if we have export demand for the oil, we could get a price spike in the middle of the prairies that has nothing to do with our supply chain. We get a high price in the prairies that makes our export basis look pretty good because we're just looking at the spot price, and it didn't have anything to do with efficiencies.
Okay, well, if I'll give Derek a token of our appreciation, if you can just give him a round of applause.
Thank you very much. Thank you.